The Bible as a Handbook for Understanding Self. Part 4. By Shane Miller. Patterns and Procedures. Leviticus and Numbers deal with methods of worship and the disciplines of the Mosaic Law, respectively. Reading these books as laymen, we find ourselves falling asleep many times because of the monotony of the repetitions. Seemingly, these books require the specialized minds of Jewish scholars for intelligent appreciation. Yet the very essence of their purpose should be understood by laymen, for, listed here, are the ways and means by which Israel proposed to keep herself alive and God-conscious. From the beginning there had always been men living as hermits in the lonely places of the earth, who through cleansing of body and mind and keeping bodily needs simple were able to contact their God. The words of some of these men were taken down in writing and when read to the people seemed to exert an influence over them through the emotions. The words somehow created symbols of forces within the soul that came alive in the hearts of the listeners. The self-induced periods of regeneration served to renew in Israel faith in its destiny as a chosen race and resulted in higher standards of decency and health at a time in the earth's history when most people were following the lusts of the body as a way of life. The use of architecture. However, the mystics did not stop at mere periodic revivals to keep their people God-conscious. They surrounded them with abstract forms of the life-inducing symbols. The Temple of Solomon, following the general lines of the tabernacle which Israel carried through the wilderness, was set up to show man's relationship to God through the soul. In Solomon's temple was a large court, known as the Court of the Gentiles, since it was open to all peoples of all races and beliefs. In booths around the court sat the various rabbis and masters. These gave discourses on points of Judaic law. And in this way Greeks, Arabs, Nubians, Syrians and other denizens of the Mediterranean world of the day came in contact with the ideals and ideas of Israel. Now, in the minds of the temple authorities, this area, alive and surging constantly with arguments and discussions, was roughly analogous to the body of man. Here was the physical counterpart, with its mixtures, of life as lived in the earth. In the center of the temple area, set upon a pedestal reached by a certain number of steps, was the holy place. This was the building that housed the congregation of Israel at worship. No Gentile was permitted entrance here. This area was sacred to the worship of those who had been born into the disciplines of Israel, the Mosaic Law. This area, in its turn, was analogous to the mind of man. Control of the mind, the condition for encountering the higher forces, was symbolized by the huge brass dish set up at the entrance to the building. It was filled with water that was mirror still. How better symbolize the control of the emotions necessary before entering into communion with the Spirit within each one of us. Within the holy place, in turn, was the Holy of Holies. It was built to depict the ideal of perfection, that original state of man, now hidden in the deepest level of his being, which he would one day reach again. Here behind a veil or curtain reposed the Mosaic Law and the Ark of the Covenant, symbolizing Israel's eternal relationship with the Creator. But how could mere man build anything that was perfect under the conditions of his present imperfections? The ceiling of this chamber was lowered, the floor raised, until the room became a perfect cube. In this way a symbol of perfection was shown, a mathematical equation. Thus, in brick, stone and marble, an anagram of the entire nature of man was set up. It was constructed in the hope, perhaps, that the uninitiated, the unenlightened would be moved unconsciously by this externalization of the inner condition. The old priests and mystics of Israel understood what we may have long forgotten, that no man really worships until he is emotionally involved. All the prayers mechanically uttered, all the chants, all the tons of incense consumed mean nothing unless and until the worshipper is committed emotionally. This pattern of body, mind, and soul as set up in the temple in Jerusalem was intended to move the unthinking, the earthly person to remember or recall, if only for a split second, the life which had been his heritage, the splendor which he, as part of the race, had abandoned. If men could thus be stirred with the same regularity as that with which they are replenished with meals or renewed by moments of rest and relaxation, then it was hoped that Israel might not stray too far from the path. Starting with the Holy of Holies, the place of perfection, the Garden of Eden, the first consciousness of man, call it what you will, we find man's course in the earth can be recapitulated. As he left the Garden of Eden, the veil dropped behind, shutting off the light of memory. He wandered into mere mentality, symbolized by the holy place, entering which he attempted to distort the creation of God. Thence he went out into the confusion and babble of mere physical existence, the court of the Gentiles. However, the way back had been set up symbolically in the very layout of the temple itself. The doors would always be open, expressing to the soul a hint of what must be done to return. This would be the course of regeneration, built into 3 dimensions for all to perceive how we are made, where we must go, and the kind of thoughts we must have in order to get there. Thus, even in the architecture of the place of worship itself, the same story as related in the Bible of man's fall into matter and his subsequent confusion was demonstrated. Perhaps that is why the details of the temple and the rituals of worship as set forth in Leviticus and Numbers have been given so carefully. The medieval cathedral. It must be remembered, however, that the Temple of Solomon was not the only 3-dimensional pattern of man's relationship to his Creator. When the Roman Empire was collapsing and civil law was at an end throughout the civilized world of that time, the Christian mystics, in their turn, were confronted with the task of bringing order out of the chaos that ensued. To merely enforce peace in the world by the perpetual threat of the sword, such as the Pax Romana provided, was not within the power of the early Church Fathers, nor was it their wish. They felt that the hearts of men could be somehow stirred and kept in an awareness of the splendor of God, awareness that He cared for His children, yes, even for those outside of the disciplines of Israel, even those who felt themselves forsaken and lost as the petty princes of that day waged their incessant internecine wars, wreaking poverty and destruction. So the early monks set up monasteries all over Europe within which they kept alive the fruits of civilization. Here were preserved the great books of the past. Here were the only schools. Here the welfare agencies of that day functioned when long lines of refugees came daily to be fed. Christ's teachings were not only transmitted verbally and in the chanted masses, but also exemplified in the feeding of the hungry, the healing of the sick and wounded, and the comforting of His children. In time, cathedrals appeared following a new departure, the Gothic style, to symbolize the reach of the soul to God. These were built for the most part in the form of the cross and rose in sweeping, tapering arches and spires so that the plowman at his humble task might look up. This was the New Testament in stone, with its message of regeneration, just as the Temple of Solomon was the story of an Older Testament. Gerald Hurd, in a short story entitled Dramanon, imagines and describes some possible exercises set up for use in the early cathedrals to bring an illiterate, hopeless people to God consciousness. Not until this was reached could civilization be restored to the world. In Hurd's story, the tiles in the floor of the cathedral were arranged in what appeared to be strange patterns. This was not for aesthetic effect but, as Hurd sets forth, to be the guide for a dance. Thus, as the congregation was led through this dance, the steps being indicated by the color of certain bricks or tiles in the floor, the body of each individual would begin to stir in certain rhythms. Circulation of the blood would be altered and with it the frequency within the cell structures. This, in turn, would alter the thoughts and ideas of the people involved, resulting in a truly moving and uplifting experience, an elevating of spirit and body. Students of today who possess more scholastic ability, perhaps, than insight, have pointed out how closely the ceremonies of the early church were built upon the rites of the pagans, such as those for spring fertility. It may be suggested that the early fathers were realistic enough to take their charges where they found them, to begin there and raise their thinking from their natural environment to a higher consciousness. Men were aware of their bodies and of the sensations that were at home there. By raising their consciousness, creativity on another plane could be restored. How better could the message be given to a people unable to read or write? What was beyond them in intellectual comprehension they could learn through the happenings in their own bodies as a result of the dance. Aztec and Mayan temples. In Mexico, the same results were brought about through worship. The Mayan and Aztec temples were built in the shape of a pyramid. On the face of these pyramid temples ran stone stairs so steep that the parishioner could not walk straight up, but had to climb in a zigzag course. A congregation mounting these stairs in single file in order to reach the place of worship at the top would wind upward, emulating the course of a serpent. The forces of Kundalini cause such a sensation of movement within a person during deep meditation, as the forces mount up the central cord of the nervous system. If we think of the temple of worship at the top of the pyramid as the head of man, then we find the Mayan congregation acting out the movement of the life force in their bodies. This led to the frame of body and mind in which the encounter with God could take place. These methods of worship, wherever they have been noted anywhere in the world, disappeared from the ken of man when they became mere routine. The ideals were lost as the fire went out. Through routine followed endlessly, physical sensation became the ideal, and then corruption ensued even within the church itself. As a result of the Reformation, safeguards were set up so that such corruption would never occur again. These resulted in time and ritualized, stabilizing procedures, calculated to maintain a constant level of performance. The pity is that the Church stabilized religious expression so thoroughly that as a consequence the worshipper is limited to less than the potential of his religious experience. What we need now is some manifestation of spirit analogous to that which maintained man through the Dark Ages. The Church may fulfill its function as the Christ promised it would, but since the religious expression of the individual seems to be curtailed by the safety measures of the Church itself, it seems necessary, nay, urgent, that the individual seek the true encounter within himself in a direct way through prayer and meditation. Man's encounter with God. The greatest concern of man has always been to understand his need for constant contact with his Creator. So far we have dealt with the mere surroundings of man at worship, with the concepts communicated by his teachers. These were designed to produce an awakening, the logical next step. Lectures, books, sacred writings, exhortation and persuasion, all of these are attempts to guide man into first-hand experience with his God. Once this contact has been truly achieved, the individual is never the same again. Always there will remain within him, because of the experience he has had, the longing to return to the secret place of the Most High, to know again the rapture of that moment when contact was made, when the bright illumination had reached out to him and claimed its own. Here was the problem of Israel: how to raise a people to this level of consciousness and hold it there. The story of Israel, and the experiences that followed the flight from Egypt, tells only too graphically of the difficulties encountered through the ages for us to wish to recapitulate them here. The need has always been to return in consciousness to the deepest source within us through the medium of prayer and meditation. Whenever this is forgotten, crowded out, perhaps, by too many fascinating earthly projects, God consciousness is lost, and in the ensuing unawareness we become accident-prone. Thus Leviticus and Numbers give some idea of what was laid down for the priests of Israel and their people to follow. If their minds were completely filled with thoughts of the sacred symbols demonstrated in ritual and chant, they would not be so likely to allow time and space for lesser, more worldly considerations. This seems to have been the premise. However, within this very discipline lay a real danger, that in time the worshipper might follow the discipline too blindly and begin to worship the symbols themselves. This was succinctly expressed by the Master himself when he pointed out that the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. This was the time, he insisted, to put aside complete preoccupation with the letter of the law and to think and act in human terms. In essence, if one lived and practiced the complete presence of God, being at all times one with God, the contact would suffice for any human situation. Moreover, one's mind would be free to act, it would not be burdened with ritual and rote, and it would not find it necessary to run to the book to find out what to do. The truly creative spiritual man can always think on his feet. He is capable of rapid decision because the law and its kingdom and condition are always within him. On this point Israel and the original Christian movement came to a parting of the ways, at least in their respective doctrines.